Daniel, why are you still here? Olivia's voice cut through the cold night air the moment she stepped out of the hospital doors. I looked up from the bench where I had been sitting for hours and stared at her like the question itself didn't make sense. You told me to wait, I said quietly. Remember? Dinner, celebration, your promotion. She glanced at Dr. Marcus Reed standing beside her, and the way her eyes moved toward him before answering me made something twist painfully inside my chest. Daniel, it was an emergency surgery, she replied, sounding tired but not apologetic. I texted you. I lifted my phone slowly and showed her the dark screen. You didn't? I checked every 10 minutes. Marcus finally spoke, his tone calm and almost amused. It was a complicated case. These things happen. I looked at him, confused by the confidence in his voice. I wasn't talking to you, I said. Olivia sighed like I had just created a problem out of nothing. Why are you making this such a big deal? She asked. I laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. A big deal? I've been sitting outside for 7 hours. Marcus shifted his weight slightly and looked toward the parking lot. Maybe we should go, he said to Olivia, like I wasn't even standing there. She nodded without hesitation, and that small moment felt heavier than anything she had said so far. Go where? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Olivia avoided my eyes as she answered. Marcus and I were going to grab something to eat. The sentence hung in the air for a moment before it fully reached my brain. You're going to dinner, now? I asked slowly. Marcus shrugged casually. We're starving after surgery. I looked back at Olivia. We were supposed to celebrate together. She crossed her arms and said, Daniel, I'm exhausted. I nodded toward the smile she had just shared with Marcus a few seconds earlier. You seem pretty energetic just now. Marcus cleared his throat. Look man, it's late. Maybe you should just go home. I stared at him. Maybe you should stop talking like you belong in my conversation. Olivia stepped slightly forward, frustration clear in her voice. Daniel, stop. But her tone sounded more irritated than concerned, and that realization made the air feel colder around me. I took a slow breath and tried to focus on Olivia again. Olivia, I waited because you asked me to. She shook her head quickly. I didn't ask you to wait 7 hours. I frowned. You said, stay close. We'll celebrate after. Those were your exact words. She didn't answer right away, and Marcus checked his watch like he had somewhere better to be. That simple movement made something inside me snap. Is he in a hurry? I asked quietly. Olivia looked annoyed now. Daniel, don't start this. I spread my hands slightly. Start what? Asking questions? Marcus chuckled under his breath. You're reading too much into things. I looked directly at him. Funny. I was thinking the same about you. Olivia's voice hardened instantly. This is ridiculous. I shook my head slowly. Is it? For a moment none of us spoke. Cars passed through the parking lot behind us while the hospital lights buzzed softly above the entrance. Then I finally forced myself to ask the question that had been building in my chest all night. Are you two together? Olivia's eyes widened. What? She said sharply. You heard me. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's a serious accusation. I didn't even look at him this time. I'm asking my wife. Olivia shook her head quickly, but something about her reaction felt rushed. You're being paranoid, she said. Am I? I asked quietly. Yes, she replied firmly. Then why won't you look me in the eye? I asked. She turned her head slightly, avoiding my gaze for just a second, but that second felt painfully long. Marcus stepped half a step closer to her and sighed. Look, Daniel, Olivia and I work together. That's it. I pointed toward them without raising my voice. 7 hours of surgery, late nights every week, and now dinner together? Olivia's voice rose slightly. I'm a surgeon. I work late. I nodded slowly. I know. I supported you through medical school. I remember every night we stayed up studying together. Marcus glanced at Olivia again, and the silent communication between them made my chest tighten. Daniel, Olivia said softly now, you're tired? I shook my head. No. I'm confused. Marcus gave a faint smirk. Maybe you're just insecure. I laughed quietly, but it sounded hollow even to me. Insecure? Watching another man stand this close to my wife while she defends him? Yeah, maybe anyone would feel the same. Olivia looked angry now. Daniel, this is embarrassing, she said sharply. For who? I asked. For me. The answer hit harder than anything else she had said tonight. I stared at her in disbelief. For you? I repeated. Yes, she said firmly. You're making a scene. I shook my head slowly, trying to understand how everything had flipped so quickly. You know what's embarrassing for me? I said quietly. Standing here and realizing I feel like a stranger in my own marriage. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck and muttered, "This is getting dramatic." I ignored him completely and focused on Olivia again. Tell me honestly, did something change between us? She hesitated, and for the first time since this conversation started, she looked unsure. What do you mean? She asked. I mean us, I said softly. Instead of answering me directly, she glanced at Marcus again. That tiny look said more than any explanation she could have given. My chest tightened painfully as I whispered, "Wow." Olivia stepped forward quickly. Daniel, no, I interrupted quietly. I think I understand. Marcus opened the passenger door of his car and said, "We should go." Olivia hesitated for only a second before walking toward the car. I stayed where I was, watching silently. You're leaving with him? I asked. It's just dinner, she said. It was supposed to be our dinner. She looked at me and sighed. Daniel, you're overreacting. I stood there in the cold parking lot long after they drove away, staring at the empty road and realizing something terrifying. Our marriage hadn't broken tonight. It had probably been breaking for a long time. And somehow I had been the last person to notice. The drive home felt longer than any road I had ever taken. The silence inside my car pressed against my chest, and every traffic light forced me to sit alone with thoughts I had been avoiding for years. I kept seeing Olivia standing beside Marcus outside the hospital. The way Olivia avoided my eyes replayed again and again in my mind. I gripped the steering wheel harder and whispered to myself, how did everything change so much? The empty passenger seat beside me felt like a reminder of every sacrifice I had made. I remembered nights when Olivia and I used to drive together while talking about the future. Olivia once squeezed my hand during one of those drives and said, Daniel, one day Olivia Parker will become a surgeon and Daniel Parker will be the reason. I laughed at the memory and muttered quietly, Daniel Parker believed every word. When I finally reached home, the house felt strangely unfamiliar. I dropped my keys on the table and sat down slowly. Olivia walked into the living room a few minutes later. Olivia looked tired but not guilty. Olivia crossed arms and asked, Daniel, why did Daniel Parker make a scene tonight? I looked up and replied, Daniel Parker waited outside a hospital for 7 hours. Daniel Parker expected dinner with Olivia Parker. Olivia sighed loudly and said, Daniel Parker knows hospital work is unpredictable. I leaned forward and said quietly, Daniel Parker also knows when something feels wrong. Olivia rolled eyes and answered, Daniel Parker is overthinking again. The calmness in Olivia's voice felt colder than anger. I asked carefully, what exactly happened tonight between Olivia Parker and Marcus Reed? Olivia's expression hardened instantly. Nothing happened, Olivia said sharply. I shook my head and replied, Daniel Parker watched Olivia Parker laughing with Marcus Reed while Daniel Parker sat alone outside. Olivia walked toward the kitchen and poured a glass of water before speaking again. Daniel Parker is acting insecure, Olivia said without looking back. The word insecure hit me harder than I expected. I stood up slowly and said, Insecure? Daniel Parker worked 2 jobs while Olivia Parker studied for medical exams. Daniel Parker paid rent, bills, and tuition. Daniel Parker stayed awake every night making coffee while Olivia Parker prepared for surgery rotations. Olivia turned around and frowned. Daniel Parker volunteered to help, Olivia replied. I laughed quietly and said, yes, Daniel Parker did. Daniel Parker believed the sacrifices meant something. Olivia placed the glass on the counter and said, Daniel Parker is bringing up old history again. I walked closer and replied softly, Daniel Parker is remembering the promises Olivia Parker made. Olivia leaned against the counter and looked away. People change, Olivia said. Careers grow. Priorities shift. I felt something tighten in my chest and asked, does that mean Olivia Parker's priorities no longer include Daniel Parker? Olivia stayed silent for a moment before answering carefully. Daniel Parker is making everything dramatic. I shook my head and replied, Daniel Parker is asking simple questions. Olivia spoke again with frustration. Daniel Parker thinks Marcus Reed is the problem. I stared at Olivia and said quietly, Daniel Parker thinks Olivia Parker stopped caring long before Marcus Reed arrived. The room went silent after those words. Olivia avoided my eyes again, and the distance between us suddenly felt wider than the entire city. After a long pause, Olivia finally spoke. Daniel Parker doesn't understand pressure inside the hospital. I replied calmly, Daniel Parker understands pressure. Daniel Parker carried pressure for years so Olivia Parker could succeed. Olivia shook head and said, Daniel Parker always wants appreciation. I felt exhaustion spreading through my chest and answered softly, Daniel Parker wanted partnership, not appreciation. Olivia looked irritated and said, Daniel Parker is turning everything into an emotional argument. I sat down again and said quietly, Daniel Parker is trying to understand why Olivia Parker suddenly feels like a stranger. Olivia grabbed the car keys from the table again. Daniel Parker should get some sleep, Olivia said. Tomorrow Olivia Parker has another early shift. I watched Olivia walking toward the door and asked one last question. Does Olivia Parker still believe in this marriage? Olivia paused but did not turn around. After a few seconds Olivia said, Daniel Parker is tired and imagining problems. The door closed gently behind Olivia. I sat alone in the living room for a long time after that. The silence in the house felt heavier than before. I looked around at the walls filled with photos from earlier years. One picture showed Olivia Parker wearing a graduation gown while smiling proudly beside Daniel Parker. I remembered the words Olivia Parker whispered that day. Everything Olivia Parker achieves belongs to Daniel Parker too. I stared at that photo and whispered quietly, Daniel Parker believed that promise. For the first time, I began to wonder if Daniel Parker had been believing in a future that only Daniel Parker could see. The house felt quieter than ever during the days after that night. I kept walking past the same rooms, hoping something would feel normal again. Nothing did. One afternoon my sister Emily knocked on the door. When I opened it, Emily studied my face carefully and said, Daniel, something is wrong. Daniel Parker looks exhausted. I tried to smile and replied, Daniel Parker is fine. Just work stress. Emily stepped inside, looked around the living room and frowned. Emily Parker knows Daniel Parker better than that. Daniel Parker hasn't slept. I sat down and said softly, things are complicated. Emily crossed arms and asked directly, is Olivia Parker part of those complications? I hesitated for a moment before answering, Daniel Parker isn't sure. Emily walked into the kitchen and glanced toward the hallway where Olivia usually kept medical files stacked on the table. Emily Parker noticed Olivia Parker barely talks anymore, Emily said quietly. I rubbed my forehead and replied, Olivia Parker is busy with hospital shifts. Emily shook head. Busy doesn't explain cold silence. Emily Parker saw Olivia Parker leave dinner early 3 times this week. I sighed and said, Daniel Parker doesn't want to assume anything. Emily looked straight at me and asked, did something happen at the hospital the other night? I stayed silent for a few seconds before speaking. Daniel Parker waited 7 hours outside the hospital. Emily's eyes widened. 7 hours? I nodded slowly. Olivia Parker left the building with Marcus Reed. Emily's voice hardened immediately. Emily Parker never trusted Marcus Reed. I leaned back in the chair and said quietly, Daniel Parker asked questions. Olivia Parker called Daniel Parker insecure. Emily walked closer and placed hands on the table. Daniel Parker thinks Marcus Reed is involved? I shook my head slowly. Daniel Parker doesn't know what to think. Emily sighed and said, Emily Parker thinks Daniel Parker already knows. I stared at the floor for a moment and whispered, Daniel Parker is afraid to confirm the answer. Emily softened slightly and said, truth hurts, but lies destroy everything. I looked up and replied, Daniel Parker hopes the truth is different. Emily nodded slowly but said nothing more. Later that evening Olivia walked past the living room while putting on a hospital coat. I asked carefully, Olivia Parker has another late shift tonight? Olivia grabbed car keys and answered without looking at me. Emergency surgery. Emily spoke suddenly from the couch. Emily Parker hopes Marcus Reed isn't the emergency. Olivia stopped walking and turned around slowly. Emily Parker always enjoys drama, Olivia replied sharply. Emily shrugged and said calmly, Emily Parker enjoys honesty. Olivia looked irritated and said, Emily Parker doesn't understand hospital life. I stepped between both voices and said quietly, Daniel Parker just wants peace tonight. Olivia picked up the keys again and said, then Daniel Parker should stop questioning everything. A few seconds later the door closed behind Olivia. Emily watched the door for a moment and then turned toward me. Emily Parker thinks Daniel Parker should follow Olivia Parker tonight. I looked surprised. Follow Olivia Parker? Emily nodded firmly. If Daniel Parker wants answers, Daniel Parker must see the truth. I hesitated, then said quietly, Daniel Parker doesn't want to believe the worst. Emily replied gently, sometimes seeing the truth is the only way to stop imagining it. I stood there for a long moment before grabbing my jacket. Daniel Parker will drive to the hospital, I said slowly. Emily nodded and replied, Emily Parker will stay here. The hospital parking garage was dimly lit when I arrived. I stayed inside my car and watched the elevator doors across the garage. A few minutes later Olivia stepped out. Marcus walked beside Olivia. My chest tightened instantly. I whispered to myself, please let Daniel Parker misunderstand this. They stopped near Marcus's car and began talking. I couldn't hear every word, but I saw Olivia laughing softly. That laugh felt different from the tired voice Olivia used at home. Marcus leaned slightly closer while speaking. Olivia didn't step away. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I watched. Marcus said something that made Olivia smile again. Then Marcus reached out and touched Olivia's arm gently. The movement looked casual, but the comfort between Olivia and Marcus felt painfully clear. I whispered to myself, Daniel Parker hoped for another explanation. Instead I watched Marcus open the car door while Olivia kept talking with relaxed ease. The distance between Olivia and Marcus looked natural, almost familiar. My chest felt heavy as the reality settled slowly inside me. For a moment I considered stepping out of the car. Instead I stayed frozen in the driver's seat. I whispered quietly, Daniel Parker already knows the answer. Watching Olivia standing comfortably beside Marcus felt like watching a stranger wearing my wife's face. The woman who once promised to build a life with me now looked completely at ease standing beside another man. That moment forced me to admit the truth I had been avoiding. I drove away from the garage slowly, feeling the silence inside the car return again. The road ahead looked empty, but the weight in my chest felt heavier than anything I had carried before. I finally said the words out loud, even though no one else was there to hear them. Daniel Parker spent years building a life around Olivia Parker. The realization settled painfully in my mind as the city lights blurred through the windshield. Now Daniel Parker must learn how to live without Olivia Parker. The parking garage felt colder than the night air outside. I stepped out of my car and walked toward Olivia and Marcus before I could change my mind. My heart was pounding, but the silence between us felt even louder. I stopped a few feet away and said quietly, Olivia, we need to talk. Olivia looked surprised for a moment, then irritation replaced the surprise. Daniel, what are you doing here? Olivia asked. I swallowed and replied, Daniel Parker came because Daniel Parker deserves answers. Marcus leaned casually against the car beside Olivia and crossed arms without saying anything. Olivia sighed and said, Daniel Parker should go home. Olivia Parker already had a long day. I shook my head slowly and said, Daniel Parker didn't come here to go home. My voice trembled slightly as I continued, Daniel Parker came to ask something important. Marcus glanced at Olivia and said calmly, Marcus Reed thinks Daniel Parker is misunderstanding things again. I ignored Marcus and focused only on Olivia. Olivia Parker, tell Daniel Parker honestly, is something happening between Olivia Parker and Marcus Reed? Olivia's expression tightened immediately. Daniel Parker is being ridiculous, Olivia replied sharply. I took a step closer and said quietly, Daniel Parker watched Olivia Parker laughing with Marcus Reed. Daniel Parker watched Marcus Reed touching Olivia Parker's arm. Marcus raised an eyebrow and said with a faint smile, Marcus Reed touches many colleagues during conversation. I looked directly at Marcus and replied, Daniel Parker wasn't asking Marcus Reed. Olivia rubbed forehead with frustration. Daniel Parker always creates drama, Olivia said. I shook head slowly. Daniel Parker isn't creating drama. Daniel Parker is asking for truth. Olivia crossed arms again and replied, Truth is simple. Olivia Parker works with Marcus Reed. That's all. I stared at Olivia for a moment and whispered, Then why does Olivia Parker look uncomfortable right now? Olivia looked away instead of answering. Marcus pushed away from the car and said calmly, Daniel Parker should trust Olivia Parker more. I felt anger rising in my chest and replied, Trust doesn't survive secrets. Olivia's patience finally snapped. Daniel Parker is acting insecure again, Olivia said loudly. The word insecure echoed painfully in my mind. I took a slow breath and said, Daniel Parker spent 7 years building a life with Olivia Parker. Daniel Parker thinks asking questions after tonight is reasonable. Olivia shook head impatiently. Daniel Parker keeps bringing up the past. I answered quietly, Daniel Parker remembers promises. Olivia laughed softly but the sound felt cold. Maybe that's the problem, Olivia said. Daniel Parker still lives in old promises. My chest tightened as I asked, Does Olivia Parker mean those promises don't matter anymore? Marcus stayed silent but watched the conversation with calm confidence. Olivia looked at Marcus for a brief moment before speaking again. That small glance hurt more than anything else. Daniel Parker is making everything complicated, Olivia said slowly. I replied, Daniel Parker is asking one simple question. The silence stretched for a few seconds before Olivia spoke again. Maybe Daniel Parker and Olivia Parker rushed into marriage years ago. The words felt unreal. I stared at Olivia, unable to breathe for a moment. Rushed into marriage? I repeated quietly. Olivia nodded slightly and continued, Olivia Parker was young back then. Daniel Parker and Olivia Parker didn't understand how careers would change everything. My voice dropped to a whisper. 7 years together, and Olivia Parker calls that rushing? Olivia looked uncomfortable but didn't take the words back. Marcus cleared throat and said quietly, Marcus Reed thinks this conversation is getting unnecessary. I turned toward Marcus and replied sharply, Daniel Parker didn't invite Marcus Reed into this marriage. Olivia raised voice slightly. Stop blaming Marcus Reed. I looked at Olivia in disbelief. Daniel Parker isn't blaming Marcus Reed. Daniel Parker is asking Olivia Parker why Olivia Parker stopped caring. Olivia's face hardened. Daniel Parker always wants emotional reassurance, Olivia said. I felt something inside me break. Daniel Parker wanted partnership, I replied quietly. Marcus glanced at Olivia again. The silent communication between them felt obvious now. I finally asked the question I had been avoiding. Does Olivia Parker still love Daniel Parker? Olivia hesitated. The hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Finally Olivia spoke slowly. Olivia Parker doesn't know anymore. Those words hit harder than anything else tonight. I stared at Olivia and whispered, Daniel Parker thought marriage meant loyalty. Olivia looked frustrated and replied, marriage also means understanding growth. I shook head slowly and said, Daniel Parker understands growth. Daniel Parker just didn't expect to be left behind. Marcus opened the car door and spoke calmly. Marcus Reed thinks everyone should cool down tonight. Olivia nodded and stepped toward the car. I watched the movement carefully and asked quietly, Olivia Parker is leaving with Marcus Reed again? Olivia answered without looking at me. Olivia Parker needs space. I stood frozen while Olivia sat inside the car. Marcus looked at me for a brief moment before closing the door. The engine started and the headlights cut through the darkness of the garage. As the car drove away, the silence around me returned. I stood alone between the empty parking spaces and whispered softly to myself, Daniel Parker already knew the answer. In that moment, the painful truth became impossible to ignore. The betrayal Daniel Parker feared had already happened long before tonight. And standing alone in that cold garage, Daniel Parker finally understood something heartbreaking. The life Daniel Parker built around Olivia Parker was already ending. A week after the confrontation in the parking garage, Olivia sat across from me at the kitchen table with the same calm expression Olivia used when discussing hospital schedules. Olivia placed folded hands on the table and said, Daniel, Olivia Parker wants a divorce. The sentence landed with quiet finality. I stared at Olivia for a moment before answering. Daniel Parker expected difficult conversations, but Daniel Parker hoped the word divorce wouldn't appear so quickly. Olivia sighed and replied, Daniel Parker deserves honesty. Olivia Parker needs freedom. I leaned back slowly and asked, freedom from what? Olivia spoke without hesitation. Freedom from expectations. Freedom from a life that no longer feels right. I shook my head slowly and said, Daniel Parker thought marriage meant facing problems together. Olivia answered calmly, sometimes marriage becomes a cage instead of a partnership. The word cage echoed painfully in my mind. I asked quietly, did 7 years together really feel like a cage to Olivia Parker? Olivia looked down briefly before replying, Olivia Parker needs space to grow. I laughed softly and said, Daniel Parker supported Olivia Parker's growth for years. Olivia responded with the same steady voice, that support is appreciated, but appreciation isn't the same as happiness. I felt my chest tighten as I said, Daniel Parker believed loyalty mattered more than temporary feelings. Olivia replied, Daniel Parker and Olivia Parker want different futures now. I stared at the table for a moment before asking, does Marcus Reed belong in that future? Olivia didn't answer directly. Olivia simply said, this conversation isn't about Marcus Reed. That silence told me everything. A few minutes later Olivia stood up and said quietly, Daniel Parker should take time to process everything. I looked at Olivia and asked one final question. Did Olivia Parker ever truly love Daniel Parker? Olivia paused at the doorway. After several seconds Olivia said softly, Olivia Parker cared deeply once. Then Olivia walked out of the room. Later that afternoon I packed my belongings in silence. Every object in the house carried a memory. The kitchen cups reminded me of late-night conversations. The couch reminded me of quiet evenings watching movies together. The bedroom doorway reminded me of the promises we once made about children and family. As I placed clothes into a suitcase, I whispered to myself, Daniel Parker built an entire life inside this house. Emily arrived shortly after I finished packing. Emily looked around the room and asked gently, did Olivia Parker really ask for divorce? I nodded slowly. Yes. Emily crossed arms and said with frustration, Emily Parker never liked Marcus Reed. I replied quietly, Daniel Parker doesn't want anger right now. Emily sighed and said softly, Emily Parker just doesn't want Daniel Parker blaming Daniel Parker. I smiled weakly and replied, Daniel Parker is too tired to blame anyone. Emily helped carry the final suitcase to the car. Before leaving, Emily placed a hand on my shoulder and said, Emily Parker believes Daniel Parker deserves better than this. I looked at the house one last time and said quietly, Daniel Parker once believed happiness lived here. The apartment I moved into felt smaller than I expected. The walls were plain and the rooms were mostly empty. I placed the suitcase near the bed and sat down on a chair that creaked slightly under my weight. The silence inside the apartment felt heavier than the silence in the old house. I whispered quietly, Daniel Parker never imagined starting over like this. That evening my father Robert knocked on the apartment door. I opened it slowly and said, Robert Parker traveled a long way tonight. Robert stepped inside and looked around before speaking. Robert Parker heard difficult news. I nodded and replied, Daniel Parker is learning how quickly life changes. Robert sat down across from me and said calmly, Robert Parker once experienced something similar. I looked surprised. Daniel Parker never heard that story. Robert smiled slightly and said, some stories stay quiet until the right moment. I leaned forward and asked, how did Robert Parker survive losing everything? Robert answered slowly, Robert Parker learned that some people enter life only to teach important lessons. I frowned and asked, lessons? Robert nodded. Yes, some people teach patience. Some teach loyalty. Others teach strength. I looked down at the floor and said quietly, Daniel Parker feels mostly pain right now. Robert replied gently, pain often arrives before understanding. I sat quietly for a moment before asking, does Robert Parker believe Daniel Parker failed? Robert shook head immediately. Robert Parker believes Daniel Parker loved honestly. That never counts as failure. Those words stayed with me longer than the silence that followed. Before leaving, Robert placed a hand on my shoulder and said one final thing. Robert Parker believes losing the wrong person sometimes opens the door for the right future. After Robert left, I sat alone in the small apartment again. The room still felt empty, but something inside me had shifted slightly. I looked around the quiet space and whispered slowly, maybe losing Olivia Parker isn't the end of Daniel Parker's story. For the first time in days, the thought didn't feel impossible. A few weeks after moving into the small apartment, my phone rang one quiet afternoon. I glanced at the screen and saw a familiar name. Grace Miller, I said softly before answering. Grace Miller still remembers Daniel Parker? I joked. Grace laughed on the other side of the call. Grace Miller remembers a lot of things about Daniel Parker. Grace Miller also heard about the divorce. I sighed and replied, news travels quickly. Grace's voice softened. Grace Miller didn't call to reopen old wounds. Grace Miller called because Daniel Parker sounds lost. I leaned back in my chair and said quietly, Daniel Parker is trying to figure out what life looks like without Olivia Parker. Grace paused before speaking again. Grace Miller remembers a different version of Daniel Parker. I frowned slightly and asked, what version? Grace answered gently, the version who had ideas, plans, and ambition before Daniel Parker decided to sacrifice everything for Olivia Parker. I looked down at the table and said quietly, Daniel Parker believed that sacrifice meant partnership. Grace responded immediately, sacrifice only works when both people protect the same dream. I stayed silent for a moment before asking, what exactly is Grace Miller suggesting? Grace spoke with clear confidence. Grace Miller thinks Daniel Parker should rebuild life instead of mourning the old one. I exhaled slowly and replied, that sounds easier than it feels. Grace laughed softly. Grace Miller never said rebuilding life would feel easy. Grace Miller said rebuilding life would be worth it. After a brief pause, Grace added, Grace Miller actually called with a specific idea. I raised an eyebrow and asked, Daniel Parker is listening. Grace Miller wants Daniel Parker to meet Jason Miller, Grace said. Jason Miller? I repeated. Grace explained, Jason Miller studies hospital management systems. Jason Miller noticed hospitals waste enormous money because administration is inefficient. I leaned forward slightly. And Grace Miller thinks Daniel Parker belongs in that conversation? Grace replied immediately, Daniel Parker spent years learning hospital operations while supporting Olivia Parker's career. Daniel Parker understands medical environments better than most consultants. I rubbed my chin and said thoughtfully, Daniel Parker never considered that knowledge valuable. Grace answered quickly, Grace Miller thinks Daniel Parker undervalues personal experience. I hesitated before replying, Daniel Parker spent years believing personal success belonged to Olivia Parker. Grace spoke firmly. Grace Miller believes Daniel Parker deserves personal success now. 2 days later I sat in a quiet coffee shop with Grace Miller and Jason Miller. Jason extended a hand and said warmly, Jason Miller heard a lot about Daniel Parker. I shook the hand and replied, Daniel Parker hopes Grace Miller shared only positive stories. Jason laughed. Grace Miller mostly mentioned resilience. I smiled slightly and said, Daniel Parker is still discovering that quality. Grace leaned forward and said, Grace Miller invited Daniel Parker because Jason Miller has an idea. Jason nodded and explained, Jason Miller believes hospitals struggle with administrative efficiency. Jason Miller wants to build a consulting service that helps hospitals fix operational problems. I listened carefully before asking, and Jason Miller thinks Daniel Parker can help? Jason answered confidently, Jason Miller thinks Daniel Parker already understands hospital culture better than many consultants. I leaned back in the chair and said slowly, Daniel Parker spent years watching Olivia Parker manage residency schedules, patient records and hospital bureaucracy. Grace smiled. Exactly, Grace said. Jason continued, Jason Miller can build the systems. Jason Miller needs someone who understands the environment where those systems must work. I thought about the idea for several seconds before speaking again. Daniel Parker never imagined entering the hospital world without Olivia Parker. Grace tilted head slightly and said gently, Grace Miller believes Daniel Parker should finally build something personal. I nodded slowly and replied, Daniel Parker is willing to try. Jason smiled and extended a hand again. Jason Miller welcomes Daniel Parker as a partner. I shook the hand firmly and said, Daniel Parker hopes this partnership lasts longer than the previous one. Over the next few weeks we worked long hours designing proposals and research reports. For the first time in years I felt energy returning to my life. One afternoon Grace walked into the office and asked, How does rebuilding feel? I smiled slightly and answered, Daniel Parker finally feels useful again. Later that evening my phone buzzed with a news notification about Olivia's hospital. The headline mentioned internal investigations connected to surgical decisions involving Marcus Reed. I stared at the screen quietly. Grace noticed the expression and asked, Bad news? I showed the phone and said softly, The hospital that built Olivia Parker's career may be facing serious problems. Grace studied the screen before replying carefully. Life moves in unexpected directions. I placed the phone down and nodded slowly. Daniel Parker spent years watching Olivia Parker build a career inside that hospital. Grace responded gently, Sometimes the same place that builds success also reveals hidden cracks. I looked around the small office filled with unfinished plans and said quietly, Daniel Parker is finally building something different. For the first time since the divorce, the future no longer looked empty. One afternoon my phone rang while I was reviewing a proposal at the office. I answered and said, Daniel Parker speaking. A calm voice replied, Sarah Bennett speaking. Sarah Bennett is a journalist investigating St. Mark Hospital. I frowned slightly and said, Daniel Parker hasn't worked at St. Mark Hospital. Sarah answered quickly, Sarah Bennett knows that. Sarah Bennett also knows Daniel Parker spent years connected to the hospital through Olivia Parker. I leaned back in my chair and replied carefully, Daniel Parker is listening. Sarah continued, Sarah Bennett is investigating several surgical reports signed during Marcus Reed's operations. I felt a quiet tension in my chest and asked, Why contact Daniel Parker? Sarah answered, Sarah Bennett believes Daniel Parker understands hospital administration better than most people outside the system. I paused for a moment before saying, Daniel Parker remembers enough about hospital paperwork to recognize problems. Sarah spoke again, Marcus Reed appears to have manipulated certain records to exaggerate surgical success rates. I raised an eyebrow and replied, that accusation sounds serious. Sarah responded calmly, the accusation is supported by inconsistencies in patient documentation. I asked slowly, where does Olivia Parker fit into this investigation? Sarah hesitated before answering. Several reports contain Olivia Parker's signature. I felt my stomach tighten. Olivia Parker signed documents connected to Marcus Reed surgeries? Sarah replied, exactly. Sarah Bennett believes Olivia Parker trusted Marcus Reed's documentation. I sighed quietly and said, Olivia Parker always trusted colleagues during complicated procedures. Sarah responded, trust becomes dangerous when someone abuses it. I stood up and walked toward the office window while thinking. Daniel Parker doesn't want to see Olivia Parker destroyed by someone else's decisions. Sarah answered gently, Sarah Bennett isn't trying to destroy anyone. Sarah Bennett is trying to reveal truth. I nodded slowly and said, truth eventually finds a way to appear. Later that day Grace Miller walked into the office and asked, Daniel Parker looks distracted. What happened? I replied, a journalist named Sarah Bennett called. Grace frowned slightly. Journalists rarely call without a reason. I nodded and explained, Sarah Bennett is investigating St. Mark Hospital and Marcus Reed. Grace leaned against the desk and asked, is Olivia Parker involved? I sighed and answered quietly, some surgical reports contain Olivia Parker's signature. Grace looked concerned and said, Grace Miller doubts Olivia Parker intentionally participated in anything dishonest. I nodded and replied, Daniel Parker believes the same thing. Grace crossed arms thoughtfully. Marcus Reed always seemed too confident. I looked out the window again and said, confidence often hides risky decisions. 2 days later the news became public. Jason Miller walked into the office holding a tablet and said, Jason Miller just read breaking news. I looked up and asked, St. Mark Hospital? Jason nodded and said, Hospital Director Henry Caldwell launched a formal investigation. Grace leaned closer and asked, does the report mention Marcus Reed? Jason replied, Marcus Reed is the central focus. I felt a strange mix of emotions and said quietly, Marcus Reed once acted like consequences didn't exist. Grace replied, consequences always arrive eventually. Jason added, Henry Caldwell is reviewing surgical records from the last 3 years. I leaned back in my chair and whispered, 3 years includes the entire period when Marcus Reed gained recognition. Grace looked at me and said gently, Daniel Parker doesn't sound surprised. I answered honestly, Daniel Parker saw arrogance long before evidence appeared. Jason placed the tablet on the desk and said, Marcus Reed may lose medical privileges if the investigation proves manipulation. I nodded slowly and replied, a reputation built on dishonesty collapses quickly. That evening I received another message from Sarah Bennett. The text read, the investigation is expanding rapidly. I showed the message to Grace and said, things are escalating. Grace studied the screen and replied quietly, Grace Miller wonders how Olivia Parker will handle this situation. I thought for a moment before answering, Olivia Parker built an entire career inside that hospital. Grace asked carefully, does Daniel Parker feel satisfaction watching Marcus Reed fall? I considered the question seriously before responding. Daniel Parker expected anger months ago. Grace tilted head slightly and asked, what does Daniel Parker feel now? I answered slowly, Daniel Parker mostly feels distance. Jason looked confused. Distance? I nodded and explained, Marcus Reed caused pain, but Daniel Parker already moved forward. Grace smiled slightly and said, that sounds like real healing. I shrugged gently and replied, Daniel Parker learned something important. Grace raised an eyebrow. What lesson? I looked around the small office we had built together and said quietly, karma rarely arrives through revenge. Jason asked curiously, then how does karma appear? I answered calmly, karma appears when truth slowly removes the masks people hide behind. Grace nodded thoughtfully. And what does Daniel Parker plan to do now? I smiled slightly and said, Daniel Parker plans to keep building a future instead of watching someone else's downfall. For the first time since the hospital scandal began, the chaos around Olivia Parker and Marcus Reed felt distant from my life. The storm that once controlled my world was now unfolding far away, while my own path continued moving forward. The office door opened slowly late one afternoon while I was reviewing a contract. I looked up and froze when I saw Olivia standing there. For a moment neither of us spoke. Olivia looked different from the confident surgeon I remembered. The strong composure Olivia once carried had disappeared. Olivia's shoulders looked tired, and Olivia's eyes carried a weight I had never seen before. I stood up slowly and said, "Olivia Parker wasn't expected here." Olivia stepped inside quietly and replied, "Olivia Parker wasn't sure Daniel Parker would even agree to see Olivia Parker." I folded my arms and said calmly, "Daniel Parker is listening." Olivia looked around the office before speaking again. Olivia Parker heard Daniel Parker built something impressive here. I shrugged slightly and replied, "Grace Miller and Jason Miller helped Daniel Parker build this company." Olivia nodded slowly and said, "Olivia Parker always knew Daniel Parker had potential." I gave a faint smile and answered, "Olivia Parker didn't always sound so certain." Olivia lowered eyes briefly and whispered, "Olivia Parker came here to apologize." The word hung quietly in the room. I leaned against the desk and said carefully, "Daniel Parker is surprised to hear that." Olivia took a deep breath before speaking again. "Marcus Reed disappeared the moment the hospital investigation began." I nodded slightly. Daniel Parker read the news. Olivia continued, "Marcus Reed stopped answering calls, stopped visiting the hospital, and stopped defending any decisions." I looked at Olivia and asked, "Olivia Parker faced the investigation alone?" Olivia nodded slowly. Every report with Marcus Reed's signature also carried Olivia Parker's name. I stayed silent while Olivia continued speaking. Hospital Director Henry Caldwell questioned Olivia Parker repeatedly. Olivia's voice trembled slightly as Olivia added, "Olivia Parker trusted Marcus Reed's documentation without checking every detail." I replied quietly, "Trust can become dangerous in the wrong hands." Olivia looked directly at me then. Olivia Parker thought ambition justified every decision. I didn't interrupt. Olivia continued slowly, "Marcus Reed encouraged Olivia Parker to move faster, perform more surgeries and build reputation quickly." I asked carefully, "And Olivia Parker followed that advice?" Olivia nodded. Olivia Parker believed success required constant progress. I sighed softly and said, "Success built on shortcuts rarely lasts." Olivia walked closer to the desk and said quietly, "When the investigation started, Marcus Reed protected only Marcus Reed." I replied calmly, "That behavior doesn't surprise Daniel Parker." Olivia's eyes filled with regret. Olivia Parker realizes that now. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally Olivia said softly, "Olivia Parker also realizes something else." I waited silently. Olivia continued, "Olivia Parker destroyed the only person who always protected Olivia Parker." I looked at Olivia and replied slowly, "Daniel Parker made many mistakes during the marriage too." Olivia shook head quickly. Olivia Parker disagrees. Daniel Parker supported every dream without asking for anything. I took a deep breath before answering. Daniel Parker asked for loyalty. Olivia nodded painfully. Olivia Parker understands that now. Olivia hesitated before speaking again. Olivia Parker thought success mattered more than patience. I replied quietly, "Success without loyalty becomes empty." Olivia sat down across from me and whispered, "Olivia Parker remembers the night Daniel Parker waited outside the hospital." I felt the memory return immediately. Olivia continued, "Olivia Parker remembers the disappointment on Daniel Parker's face." I remained silent while Olivia finished the sentence. Olivia Parker should have listened that night. I looked at Olivia carefully and said, "Daniel Parker waited 7 hours hoping for a simple dinner." Olivia closed eyes briefly. Olivia Parker was chasing recognition instead of protecting love. I replied calmly, "Ambition can blur judgment." After a moment Olivia spoke again. "Olivia Parker wants to know something." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Daniel Parker is listening." Olivia asked quietly, "Does Daniel Parker hate Olivia Parker now?" I considered the question before answering. "Daniel Parker doesn't feel hatred." Olivia looked surprised. "Not even after everything?" I shook my head slowly. "Hatred requires emotional energy Daniel Parker no longer carries." Olivia looked down at the floor and whispered, "Olivia Parker hoped for forgiveness." I paused before replying carefully. "Forgiveness already happened months ago." Olivia looked up quickly. "Then why does Daniel Parker sound distant?" I answered calmly, "Because forgiveness doesn't rebuild the past." Olivia stared at me for a moment before asking another question. "Does Daniel Parker ever think about starting again?" I smiled faintly and said gently, "Daniel Parker already started again." The silence between us felt different now. The tension that once filled every conversation had faded. Olivia stood up slowly and said, "Olivia Parker understands." I nodded and replied quietly, Daniel Parker hopes Olivia Parker finds peace after everything. Olivia looked around the office one last time before walking toward the door. Just before leaving, Olivia said softly, Daniel Parker deserved better. I watched Olivia step into the hallway and disappear from view. Standing alone in the office, I realized something important. The man who once waited outside a hospital hoping for attention no longer existed. A year passed faster than I expected. One evening I stood near the large office window watching the city skyline glow under the setting sun. Grace walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee and said, Grace Miller believes Daniel Parker forgot to eat lunch again. I turned and smiled. Daniel Parker remembers lunch. Daniel Parker simply prioritized finishing the hospital proposal. Grace handed a cup to me and replied, Grace Miller hopes the proposal doesn't become Daniel Parker's entire personality. I laughed quietly and said, Daniel Parker's personality improved after work replaced emotional chaos. Grace leaned against the desk and asked softly, Does Daniel Parker ever think about the old life anymore? I looked at the skyline for a moment before answering. Daniel Parker remembers the past sometimes, but Daniel Parker doesn't live there anymore. Grace nodded slowly and said, Grace Miller noticed something important about Daniel Parker during the past year. I raised an eyebrow. What observation does Grace Miller want to share? Grace smiled slightly. Grace Miller noticed Daniel Parker stopped apologizing for personal happiness. I chuckled and replied, Daniel Parker spent too many years believing personal success belonged to Olivia Parker. Grace shook head gently. Grace Miller believes Daniel Parker finally understands personal success belongs to Daniel Parker. I took a sip of coffee and said, Daniel Parker also understands something else now. Grace looked curious. Grace Miller is listening. I replied quietly, Daniel Parker understands betrayal sometimes clears the path toward a better life. Jason walked into the office holding a folder and said, Jason Miller hopes the philosophical conversation isn't replacing actual business. I smiled and replied, Daniel Parker promises productivity still exists. Jason placed the folder on the desk and said proudly, Jason Miller finalized another consulting contract. Grace raised eyebrows. Another hospital? Jason nodded. 3 hospitals in the same network. I opened the folder and said, Daniel Parker appreciates the momentum. Jason sat down and asked casually, Does Daniel Parker ever think about how different life looks now? I nodded slowly. Daniel Parker thinks about that often. Grace crossed arms and asked gently, And what conclusion does Daniel Parker reach? I leaned back and answered honestly. Daniel Parker realizes the marriage ended before Daniel Parker understood personal worth. Jason nodded thoughtfully and said, Jason Miller believes personal worth becomes clear only after adversity. Grace smiled and added, Grace Miller believes Daniel Parker handled adversity better than expected. I laughed softly. Daniel Parker appreciates the encouragement. Later that evening Grace and I stepped onto the rooftop terrace of the building. The sky glowed orange and gold above the city. Grace leaned against the railing and said quietly, Grace Miller remembers the first phone call after the divorce. I smiled faintly. Daniel Parker remembers that call clearly. Grace continued, Grace Miller heard exhaustion in Daniel Parker's voice. I nodded slowly and replied, Daniel Parker felt completely lost during that time. Grace looked at the horizon and said gently, Grace Miller never doubted Daniel Parker's ability to rebuild life. I turned toward Grace and asked, Grace Miller always believed that? Grace smiled softly. Grace Miller believed Daniel Parker simply needed to rediscover personal value. I rested my arms on the railing and said thoughtfully, Daniel Parker spent years supporting Olivia Parker's dreams. Grace nodded. Grace Miller knows. I continued quietly, Daniel Parker never realized that support also built strength. Grace looked at me and said, Grace Miller believes that strength changed Daniel Parker. We stood quietly for a moment while the sunlight faded across the skyline. Finally Grace asked something unexpected. Does Daniel Parker regret loving Olivia Parker? I thought carefully before answering. Daniel Parker doesn't regret love. Grace tilted head slightly. Grace Miller expected that answer. I smiled gently. Daniel Parker regrets ignoring personal dreams. Grace laughed softly. Grace Miller plans to remind Daniel Parker about personal dreams regularly. I raised my coffee cup slightly. Daniel Parker welcomes the reminder. After a few moments Grace spoke again. Grace Miller wants to ask one more question. I nodded. Daniel Parker is ready. Grace looked directly at me and asked quietly, Does Daniel Parker believe happiness exists again? I looked across the glowing skyline and answered slowly. Daniel Parker believes happiness exists right here. Grace smiled warmly and said, Grace Miller suspected that answer. I turned toward Grace and asked, Grace Miller deserves the same question. Grace raised eyebrows playfully. Grace Miller is listening. I asked softly, does Grace Miller regret helping Daniel Parker rebuild life? Grace laughed and shook head. Grace Miller considers that decision one of the smartest choices ever made. I smiled and replied, Daniel Parker agrees. A comfortable silence settled between us while the final light of sunset faded behind the buildings. The past year replayed quietly in my thoughts. The hospital parking lot. The painful conversations. The empty apartment. Every difficult moment that once felt overwhelming now looked like a stepping stone toward something stronger. Grace eventually spoke again. Grace Miller believes life works in strange ways. I nodded slowly. Daniel Parker agrees. Grace continued, some people arrive to stay forever. Others arrive to teach important lessons. I smiled slightly and replied, Daniel Parker learned that lesson clearly. Grace rested elbows on the railing and said quietly, Grace Miller also believes Daniel Parker deserves a future that feels peaceful. I looked around the growing company, the city skyline, and the friendships that had become my new foundation. Then I answered honestly. Daniel Parker believes that future already started.